The kind of silence that creeps into a town before anyone realizes what's missing. The sound of footsteps on cobbled streets, the laughter that rises from tavern corners, or the echo of a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. In the early months of 1629, as spring brushed the Lombard plains of northern Italy, that silence began to spread. You might imagine Italy then, not the Italy of golden sunsets and busy piazzas you know from pictures, but one divided into duchies, republics, and foreign-held territories. Milan stood as one of the proudest cities in the Spanish Empire's holdings. It was a place of trade, ambition, and endless motion. Merchants from Genoa, peasants from the countryside, soldiers from distant lands, all moved through its narrow streets and under its stone arches. Yet beneath that restless hum, something unseen had already entered. The first whispers came from the north, from the routes leading down through the Alps. Soldiers returning from the 30 Years' War, exhausted, ill-fed and unwashed, trudged into the Lombard plains. Many came through the mountain passes of Tyrol, carrying spoils, wounds, and something else that clung to their skin and breath, a contagion. At first, it was dismissed as a mere camp sickness, common among men who'd lived too long without clean water or sleep. The hospitals of Milan, overcrowded and understaffed, noted nothing unusual. Fever, swelling, sudden death. The city had seen it all before. But by early June, the signs became unmistakable. The swelling of the lymph nodes, dark blotches on the skin, and the terrifying speed with which life slipped away. The city physicians, many trained in the grand halls of Padua and Bologna, began to whisper a name they dared not say aloud: peste, the plague. Outside the city, in the villages of the Lombard plain, the fear spread faster than the disease. Peasants sealed themselves in their cottages, leaving the sick to die alone. Church bells tolled not for worship, but for death. And the roads, once alive with carts and chatter, grew empty. In Milan, the authorities acted slowly. The plague, they said, was a superstition. The governor's council, dominated by wealthy merchants and Spanish officials, feared that word of an epidemic would ruin trade. The markets had to stay open. The grain from Pavia must still arrive. And so they denied what their eyes could see. But silence is not so easily denied. It deepened in the streets as more houses went dark. Families began to vanish. First the poor in the alleys near Porta Ticinese, then the butchers, the bakers, the servants of noble houses. Those who could afford to flee escaped to the countryside, taking with them the seeds of the same death they hoped to avoid. There were men who profited from this silence. The Menotti, the corpse carriers, stalked the streets at night. Clad in tattered garments soaked with vinegar, they dragged carts through the dark, calling out in hollow voices for the dead. "Portate I vostri morti," they cried. "Bring out your dead." You can almost hear the creak of their wheels echoing down the empty lanes, the sound swallowed by the thick summer air. The smell of decay, of fear, clung to everything. Yet, amid the horror, the machinery of faith and superstition stirred. Priests moved from house to house with incense and relics, muttering Latin prayers. Some believed the sickness was divine punishment. Others blamed foreign soldiers or poisoned wells. In the confusion, the first executions began. Men accused of spreading the plague through anointing doors with infected oils. One such man was Guglielmo Piazza, a humble barber's assistant. He was arrested near Porta Oriente after a woman claimed to have seen him marking a wall with strange grease. Under torture, he confessed to what he did not understand, naming another, Gian Giacomo Mora, a barber who lived in a small shop on the Via di San Stefano. He too was taken. His tools, his home, even his family, all destroyed. In the square, his shop was razed to the ground, and a stone plaque placed there warning future generations never to forget the plague spreaders. The people, desperate for someone to blame, believed it. Few asked how a barber could bring death to an entire city. By autumn, the truth could no longer be hidden. Tens of thousands were gone. In some parishes, only a handful of names remained on the rolls. The Lazaretto di Milan, the great plague hospital, overflowed. Within its vast courtyard, thousands lay on straw, their breaths shallow, their eyes glassy. Some prayed, others simply waited for the end. And yet, even then, amid all the despair, human life went on. A baker in the district of Porta Vercellina kept his oven burning as long as his flour lasted. A nun at the convent of Santa Maria tended the dying with a gentleness that history would never record. A child, too young to understand, played with pebbles in the dust outside the Lazzaretto gate. The great city of Milan had fallen silent, but beneath that silence, something strange endured. A flicker of defiance, a refusal to vanish completely. And as winter approached, with the snow settling over roofs and empty courtyards, one question lingered in every home that still had a beating heart. Would spring ever come again?
By the time the new year of 1630 crept into Milan, the city was no longer the proud jewel of Lombardy. It was a shadow, a ghost of itself. The plague that had begun in whispers now ruled openly, stalking through every alley, cloister, and home. The snow that winter was thick and heavy. It muffled the world, laying a white shroud across rooftops and empty courtyards. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful, the stillness of a sleeping city, but up close it was something else. The snow was never truly white. It carried soot from the endless fires used to burn infected bedding and clothes. It carried the ashes of homes set alight to purify them. The air was never still. It was thick with the smoke of fear. The Lazaretto, once a place for travelers and pilgrims, had become a city within a city. Behind its tall walls, tens of thousands of men, women, and children lay side by side. Priests walked the aisles between them with incense, trying to cover the stench of death. You can imagine the sound, not cries or screams, but a low, continuous murmur, prayers, fevered mutterings, the shuffling of straw as bodies turned restlessly. Food was scarce. Bread, once sold in markets for a few coins, now cost entire wages. The poor starved quietly, and the rich locked themselves in villas outside the city, hoping their walls would hold back death. But walls, no matter how thick, could not stop the unseen. The plague slipped through doors, traveled on hands, lingered in cloth and coin. Outside the city, in the Lombard countryside, life fared no better. The small towns, Lodi, Cremona, Bergamo, all reported deaths by the hundreds. Farmers left their fields unplowed, their livestock untended. The once green plains of Lombardy, famed for their abundance, lay brown and quiet. In the midst of all this, the church took on a new role, not just as spiritual guide, but as record-keeper of the apocalypse. Parish priests filled their registers with names until there was no space left. Some began to write only numbers. Others, too weary, stopped altogether. Yet there were those who still tried to fight, to understand. One such man was Father Felice Casati, a physician priest trained in Bologna. He believed the sickness might be spread not by miasma or divine wrath, but by contact, by the touch of the sick or their belongings. He urged for quarantines, for strict isolation of the infected. Few listened. The people trusted prayers more than science, and even the governor's council dismissed his pleas. In February, a letter arrived from Venice. The Venetian Republic, famed for its strict quarantines, offered advice. Burn the clothes, seal the gates, isolate the sick. But Milan's rulers hesitated again. To close the city meant to cut off trade, and trade meant power. So they waited. And while they waited, death multiplied. By March, the snow had begun to melt, revealing what winter had hidden: doorways marked with red crosses, carts left abandoned, streets littered with straw where the sick had lain. The air grew warmer, and with it the fleas and rats awoke. The plague found new life in the thaw. Across the Lombard plains, stories emerged, not of kings or generals, but of ordinary souls. A washerwoman in Pavia, who buried her whole family and continued to tend to others. A gravedigger in Cremona, who worked until he himself was found slumped beside the pit he had dug. A young novice in a convent who wrote by candlelight, "If I live, I shall tell no one of this, for they would not believe it." The roads connecting the cities, once lifelines of trade, became lines of contagion. Couriers and merchants carried both messages and death from Milan to Mantua, from Bergamo to Verona. The plague, like a slow-moving storm, rolled across northern Italy, darkening everything in its path. And yet for every act of despair there was one of quiet endurance. In the village of Melegnano, a small group of peasants gathered nightly in the church, lighting candles in silence. They did not pray aloud, for fear of disturbing the dying who lay outside the walls. They simply sat, men, women, children, holding the light, as if by keeping the flame steady they might somehow hold back the darkness. It was in these small gestures that the human spirit persisted. The large acts of heroism were rare. The plague did not allow for them. Instead, survival itself became a form of courage. By April, the plague had reached its most terrible peak. Milan's population, once over 120,000, was cut in half. The bells no longer tolled for each death. There were too many. Fires burned day and night outside the city walls, consuming the bodies that could not be buried fast enough. There were rumors that the governor himself had fled to a fortified villa near Monza. The city, leaderless, turned to rumor and superstition. Strange pamphlets circulated, claiming that demons had been seen in the night or that witches had cursed the wells. Some believed that God himself had turned his face away from Lombardy. In the midst of all this, the plague's symptoms seemed to shift. The fevers burned hotter, the swellings darker. Even the physicians began to fall ill, one after another. The few who survived wrote desperate accounts, describing the disease not with the detachment of scholars, but with the trembling pen of witnesses. By midsummer, when the air grew thick and the crops withered in the fields, Milan was silent again. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, doors ajar, shutters flapping in the warm breeze. Grass began to grow between the cobblestones. Dogs roamed the streets ownerless. And then slowly, something changed. The number of dead began to fall. The air, although still heavy with decay, grew quieter. The Menotti's carts became fewer. For the first time in months, the priests' registers recorded more survivors than deaths. The plague, it seemed, was losing its strength. No one celebrated. They were too weak, too uncertain. The city was a graveyard of memories, but there was a sense, faint, fragile, that life might return. In August, the church held a procession in honor of St. Charles Borromeo, the great archbishop who had guided Milan through the plague of 1576. The few who could walk came, barefoot and silent, carrying candles through the streets. They moved past the ruins of Mora's house, past the charred remains of markets, through the empty square before the cathedral. Some said they felt the air change that night, as though for the first time in a long while the city exhaled. By autumn, the worst had passed, but the cost was beyond comprehension. Entire families erased, villages without children, fields without farmers. Milan had lost over 60,000 souls. Across northern Italy, the toll reached hundreds of thousands. And yet history barely remembered it. The 30 Years' War continued elsewhere, drawing Europe's attention. The Great Plague of London, 36 years later, would capture the imagination of writers and chroniclers. But the Italian plague, the silent catastrophe, faded into the margins of time. Only in a few surviving diaries, a few church records, and the weathered stones of forgotten graves does its memory linger. And as you imagine that quiet, fire-lit night in Milan, the streets empty, the air still, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of the bells that once tolled endlessly, now silenced at last. The silence that began as fear had become something else entirely, a silence of remembrance. But the question remained, whispered in the corridors of the few houses that still stood, and written in the hearts of those who survived. Would they ever speak of it again? Or would the world, so eager to move forward, simply forget?
The silence that fell over Milan in the late months of 1630 did not stay confined within its walls. Silence, like sound, travels. It passed across the Lombard plains, through the marshes of the Po River, and along the narrow trade routes that had once been the lifeblood of Italy's northern cities. Each road carried both memory and infection, and every traveler who set out carried the ghost of Milan's suffering with them. To the east, in the direction of Venice, the land flattened into a series of canals, villages, and fields. This was one of the richest regions in Europe, not only in silver or silk, but in intellect and trade. Here in cities like Verona, Vicenza, and Padua, scholars debated philosophy, merchants financed expeditions, and artisans built the foundations of what would later be called the Italian Renaissance. But now, in 1630, that light dimmed. When news of the Milanese plague reached Verona, the city council reacted swiftly. Venetian governors, who ruled much of northern Italy at the time, had already lived through outbreaks before. They were wary of panic, but even more wary of disruption to commerce. Venice's prosperity depended on its ports and its ability to maintain trade even during disaster. So, they turned to what they knew best: bureaucracy. Orders were written, sealed, and distributed across the Republic's territories. They commanded isolation, fumigation, and the inspection of travelers. The city gates of Verona were closed. Guards were stationed at bridges and toll posts. The movement of goods was restricted to clean bills of health. But like all human plans against nature, it came too late. By the time the first restrictions were enacted, the contagion had already entered Verona, carried, perhaps, by a wagon of grain or the hem of a traveler's cloak. The initial cases were few: a merchant's wife, a young apprentice, a baker's child. But within days, the pattern was unmistakable. The black swellings, the fever, the delirium. The city panicked. Inside the walls, fear turned ordinary men into zealots. Suspicion became a kind of contagion of its own. The people began to see plague where there was none, and to imagine plots in every shadow. There were rumors, dark, irrational rumors, that the disease was being spread intentionally. Some whispered that the French had sent agents to poison the wells. Others swore that witches or greasers, men who supposedly smeared infected ointment on doors and benches, were to blame. The authorities, desperate to assert control, began to arrest anyone who seemed suspicious. In one tragic episode, an elderly man accused of anointing was dragged through the streets and executed without trial. The true cause of his supposed crime? He had been seen wiping his hands on a wall, likely to steady himself as he walked. The plague's cruelty was not just in its symptoms, but in what it did to the mind. It stripped away reason, leaving behind the raw instinct of survival and fear. And so, as Verona descended into hysteria, the plague thrived. The city's great amphitheater, the Roman arena that had once hosted performances and gatherings, became a burial site. Pits were dug in its floor, the ancient stones echoing once more, not with applause, but with the sound of shovels striking earth. Meanwhile, in Venice itself, the situation was both better managed and more harrowing. The Venetian Republic had centuries of experience with plague. It had even built entire islands dedicated to quarantine. Lazaretti, they were called, from the name of Saint Lazarus, patron of lepers. When new cases appeared in 1630, the government immediately reactivated these islands. Ships arriving in the lagoon were halted and inspected. Sailors were detained for 40 days, the origin of the very word quarantine. The healthy were sent to the Lazaretto Nuovo and the sick to the Lazaretto Vecchio. If you could stand on the shore and look across the lagoon at night, you might have seen the glow of torches flickering on those islands, like stars adrift on the water. Each light marked a human life, someone isolated, waiting to recover or die. On the mainland, physicians and friars recorded their observations meticulously. One of them, Giovanni Battista Berti, wrote that the disease devours the flesh like a slow fire, and the soul before the body. He described families abandoning their own, and servants refusing to touch their masters. He wrote, "The fear is more universal than the contagion itself." Inside the palaces of Venice, the patricians held council. They debated whether to close the markets, to suspend the carnival, to stop the printing of newspapers. But even among the powerful, there were divisions. Some insisted that commerce must continue, that the Republic's wealth and prestige depended upon the flow of goods. Others argued that nothing, not gold, not honor, could outweigh the preservation of life. In the end, compromise failed both aims. The markets remained partly open, and so did the ports. And by midsummer, the plague reached the city proper. Venice, that beautiful, improbable city of marble and water, became a place of death. The gondolas that once carried lovers and merchants now bore coffins. The bells of San Marco rang so often that their sound faded into the rhythm of daily life. Dogs fought over food in the alleys, and the canals themselves began to smell of decay. But still, the Venetians documented everything. One of the Republic's scribes, writing in the archives of the ducal palace, noted that it is not enough to suffer, one must also remember. He believed that the act of writing, even amid despair, was a kind of resistance, that by recording the plague, Venice could preserve something of its humanity. Not far from Venice, in Mantua, the story was equally bleak. The city lay along the river Mincio, surrounded by marshes, beautiful but treacherous lands where disease lingered easily. Mantua's ruler, Duke Carlo I Gonzaga, ordered his city sealed and the sick expelled. The guards refused.
They said, "We would rather die within our walls than in the fields among strangers." And so, Mantua closed in on itself. The plague entered anyway. In a letter written by a Capuchin friar that same year, he described walking through the deserted streets. "The doors are marked with ash, the air thick with lime and vinegar. The cries of the dying echo from behind the shutters. I have buried 50 in 2 days, and I am weary, not of labor, but of sorrow." By autumn, northern Italy was united, not by politics or trade, but by suffering. Across the plains of Lombardy and the Veneto, the toll was staggering. Fields rotted where grain should have grown. Rivers ran quietly between villages that no longer smoked. Church bells, once symbols of community, became instruments of dread. But beneath this devastation, small fragments of order persisted. Venetian inspectors continued their daily rounds. Priests gave last rites from doorways, their voices trembling through masks soaked in vinegar. Apothecaries recorded recipes for plague water, mixtures of rosemary, juniper, and wormwood, even though none truly worked. Midwives delivered children, some of whom lived only hours. These acts, small, nearly invisible, formed the hidden architecture of endurance. As the year waned, the plague's strength began to falter once more. The fires burned down, the smoke thinned, and the records, so full of names, grew shorter by the week. People began to emerge from their homes, blinking into the pale light of a new year. They spoke softly, as though afraid to wake something that still slept beneath the streets. But as the year waned, the plague's strength began to falter once more. The fires burned down.
By the winter of 1630, the plague had begun to fade, but its shadow stretched long across northern Italy. The fires that once burned to cleanse the streets had dwindled to embers, and the smell of smoke, once sharp and constant, now clung only faintly to the stone walls of deserted houses. The cities, though quiet, were far from peaceful. Every corner of Milan, Venice, Verona, and Mantua bore signs of what had happened. You could see it in the shuttered windows, in the faint outlines of crosses that had been painted with ash or lime upon doors now weathered by rain, and in the unspoken stillness between the people who survived. It was not just the dead who haunted these places, but the living who carried their memory of them. In Milan, the Tribunale di Sanità, the Board of Health, reconvened to assess the damage. The members, those who remained alive, sat in a hall that still smelled faintly of vinegar and candle wax, surrounded by ledgers stacked high with mortality lists. They had kept these records obsessively throughout the plague: names, ages, professions, dates of death. Pages upon pages of handwriting that became increasingly hurried as the months went on. The final count, they believed, was close to 140,000 souls lost in Milan alone. Yet even this number was only an estimate. Many had died unrecorded, in the countryside, in convents, in the fields where no priest dared to go. As the officials debated what should be done next, one of them remarked quietly, "We have survived the pestilence, but not the memory of it." The words were not written down in any official record, but they lingered, passed quietly from one survivor to another. Outside the city, in the small villages that dotted Lombardy, life resumed with hesitant steps.
Farmers returned to their land, though their oxen had died and their children were gone. The fields, left untended for months, had become overgrown with weeds. The first act of recovery was not celebration, but cultivation. They cut the grass, repaired the fences, and dug the earth once more, because in the end, survival always begins with work. In Verona, a city that had once echoed with song and laughter, the sound of bells slowly returned. At first, they rang only for Mass, small gatherings of the faithful who dared to return to the churches. Later, they rang to mark marriages and births again. Yet even the joyous occasions carried a strange solemnity. The faces of the newlyweds were pale, the baptisms quiet. The priest's blessing was often followed by a whispered prayer for those who had not lived to see the day. The plague had altered not just the living, but the very fabric of society. Before the outbreak, northern Italy had been a land of confidence and splendor. The Renaissance spirit, though fading, still pulsed through its veins. Scholars debated Aristotle in Padua. Painters studied light and form in Florence. Architects dreamed of perfect domes and harmonious proportions. But the plague changed the tone of these dreams. Where once there had been grandeur, now there was humility. The art that emerged in the years following 1630 reflected this shift. In frescoes and altarpieces, the saints were painted not as distant, flawless beings, but as weary figures with human sorrow in their eyes. The Virgin Mary, once depicted as radiant and untouchable, was now shown mourning amid ruined landscapes. Even the angels seemed tired. Architects, too, began to think differently. The great plague churches, like Venice's Santa Maria della Salute, were not designed merely to impress, but to console. Their proportions were harmonious, their domes vast and filled with light, but beneath the grandeur lay a message of fragility. Every column, every mosaic, whispered of impermanence. In Venice, the construction of the Salute became a symbol of recovery. The decision to build it was made while the plague still lingered. It was an act of faith, a declaration that life, though wounded, would continue. The architect, Baldassare Longena, envisioned a church that would rise like a flower from the waters of the lagoon, its great dome visible from every corner of the city. When the foundations were laid, it was said that the laborers worked in silence, as if building a tomb for the dead and a monument for the living at the same time. Meanwhile, in smaller towns like Bergamo and Cremona, more modest gestures marked the end of the plague. In some places, crosses were carved into stone at the city gates, engraved with the words "Post pestem gratia Dei," after the plague, by the grace of God. In others, local artists painted ex voto panels, small devotional paintings offered in thanks for deliverance. These were not grand works of art, but deeply personal ones. A family kneeling in prayer, a saint hovering above, and in the corner, the faint outlines of coffins. Such images filled chapels and oratories across the region. To the people who survived, they were not mere symbols, they were proof that their suffering had not been unnoticed. But the world that emerged from the plague was not the same as before. The economy, which had thrived on trade and agriculture, was shattered. Skilled craftsmen had died, merchants had gone bankrupt, and once prosperous families found themselves reduced to poverty. The price of labor rose sharply, for there were fewer hands to work the fields or build the ships. Some historians later called this a hidden blessing. The scarcity of workers gave peasants new bargaining power, leading to gradual changes in the rigid hierarchies of feudal life. Yet, in the short term, it was misery. The streets of many towns were filled with beggars, widows, and orphan children. Hospitals, or what passed for hospitals in that time, were overwhelmed not by the sick, but by the destitute. The church, too, found itself changed. Its priests had been among the bravest and the most vulnerable during the plague. Many had died administering last rites. Others had survived, but not without questioning. If God had permitted such suffering, what did that say about His will? Was the plague punishment or merely a test? These questions echoed in sermons and writings for years afterwards. Some saw the epidemic as divine retribution for human arrogance, for the wealth, pride, and decadence of Italian society. But others, more quietly, began to suggest that it was part of the natural order. A tragedy, yes, but not necessarily a moral one. In this way, the plague began to shift not only medicine, but theology. The line between science and faith, once firm, started to blur. Physicians who had once relied on astrology or divine intervention began to study the physical causes of disease. They observed patterns, recorded symptoms, and discussed contagion as a matter of air and contact rather than punishment or sin. One doctor in Bologna, Lorenzo Peruzzi, wrote that the plague seemed to travel with the breath of men, moving from one body to another like invisible smoke. Though he did not yet understand bacteria, his intuition marked a quiet step towards modern medicine. Even ordinary people noticed these changes. Herbalists and apothecaries became more valued. Cleanliness, once a luxury, was spoken of as necessity. The air was fumigated with rosemary and juniper. Wells were cleaned, houses whitewashed, and city ordinances on waste and sewage became stricter. In many ways, the plague acted as a harsh teacher, cruel but effective. It taught the people of northern Italy to be wary of complacency, to question the world around them, and to prepare for the unseen. But the scars remained. Generations after the plague had passed, its memory endured in language and custom. Old proverbs arose. He who survived the year of the plague need not fear hunger. Parish registers were filled with gaps where whole families vanished, and in the margins of books and manuscripts, readers left notes, written in the year of the plague, when all were silent. For those who lived through it, the silence itself became a kind of companion. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of reverence, the quiet that follows catastrophe, when words feel too fragile to carry what the heart remembers. Even centuries later, when modern Italy would rise from these same plains, with trains, factories, and bustling streets, the ghosts of 1630 still lingered beneath the stones.
The plague may have retreated from the streets, but its influence had only begun to take root in the lives of those who survived. By the spring of 1631, a hesitant normality began to settle across northern Italy. The bells that once tolled endlessly for the dead now rang for new reasons. The reopening of markets, the return of the guilds, the cautious revival of trade. But behind this sound of life lurked a deep transformation, one that would reshape not only daily existence, but the very foundations of power, science, and belief. The cities that had endured the plague, Milan, Venice, Verona, and Mantua, emerged scarred but alert, their leadership humbled, and their citizens changed. In Milan, the ruling Spanish governor, Ambrogio Spinola, faced a city that had lost almost half its population. The grandeur of the ducal palaces now felt hollow. The plazas that once hosted merchants and musicians stood wide and echoing. And the bureaucratic machinery that once spun with precision, collecting taxes, enforcing law and maintaining order, was shattered. To restore life, Spinola and the Tribunale di Sanità issued a new set of ordinances, laws about cleanliness, trade, and urban conduct. Every household was required to keep its waste sealed and its water sources covered. The washing of clothes in public fountains was forbidden. The sale of food and meat was monitored by new inspectors. There were even rules about how far funerals could proceed from the church. Such measures might seem trivial now, but to the people of the 17th century, they represented a revolution. For the first time, civic order was being built not on wealth or lineage, but on health, the invisible condition that determined survival. The plague had taught cities to see disease as a matter of governance. Venice, always a city of innovation, went further. Its government, long famed for its efficiency, began to treat medicine as a matter of state security. The Venetian Senate created what we might call the first public health intelligence network. Ship captains were now required to report the health of their crews before docking. Letters from plague-infected regions were fumigated before being opened. Travelers were quarantined in the lazzaretti, vast, isolated hospitals on the islands of the lagoon, for a full 40 days before entering the city proper. These measures were strict, sometimes even cruel, but they worked. Venice would not suffer another major plague on this scale again. It was in these years that a new kind of official emerged, the health magistrate, a man of both law and medicine. He was not a doctor, but he read reports from doctors. Not a priest, but he oversaw the burial of the dead. Not a merchant, but he managed the flow of trade to prevent contagion. His power came not from birth or title, but from understanding how disease moved through human life. It is difficult to overstate how radical that idea was in its time. Before the plague, a ruler's strength was measured in armies and coin. After it, power began to depend on something quieter: information, organization, and foresight. The great families of Italy, the Gonzagas, the Viscontis, the Borromeos, began to sponsor not just artists and musicians, but physicians, architects, and scholars who could make their cities safer. You can still see the traces of this new mindset in the architecture that followed. City walls, once designed for war, began to be reimagined as barriers for health. Streets were widened for airflow. Wells were covered. In Venice and Milan, new fountains were built, not as ornaments, but as instruments of sanitation. The plague had become a teacher in urban design. At the same time, it became a quiet force in politics. The immense suffering of the epidemic had eroded public trust in the ruling elites. People who once accepted the authority of nobles and clergy without question now began to ask whether those authorities had done enough to protect them. In pamphlets and sermons, whispers spread. Had the rich fled too soon? Had the priests prayed enough? Had the city governors failed their people? Some historians later referred to this as the first Italian crisis in faith in government. Though it did not produce open revolt, it left behind a simmering awareness that leadership must be justified by competence, not divine right. This change was subtle, but enduring. In the archives of Mantua survives a curious letter written by a local tailor to his cousin after the plague. The lords were hidden in their villas, and the priests shut their doors, but the women of the streets carried the dead and tended the sick. I say to you, cousin, the worth of a man is not his title, but his courage. Such words were rare in a world still shaped by hierarchy, but they spoke of a truth that could no longer be forgotten. The plague had blurred the boundaries of class, at least for a moment. In the face of death, everyone had been equal, noble or beggar, priest or heretic. And though the old order would return, it would never again seem as solid as before. Meanwhile, a quieter transformation was taking place in the realm of thought. Doctors and scholars who had survived the plague began to question the ancient teachings that had guided medicine for centuries. The humoral theory, the belief that illness came from an imbalance of the body's four fluids, seemed insufficient to explain the horror they had seen.
The air, yes, was foul, but why did some die and others survive? Why did infections seem to move invisibly, yet precisely from house to house? In Padua, a young physician named Giovanni Nardi began to write a treatise on contagion. He proposed that disease was not a punishment sent by God, but a natural corruption that spread through contact and breath. Though his work was dismissed by some as heresy, it circulated quietly among scholars. It would take nearly 2 centuries before his ideas found their full expression in the germ theory of Louis Pasteur, but the seed had been planted in these plague years. Science, like faith, had been transformed by necessity. And yet, for all these changes, life itself remained fragile. In the countryside, famine followed the plague. So many laborers had died that the harvest failed. The surviving peasants were forced to work longer hours for dwindling pay. In Lombardy, entire villages were abandoned. The wild reclaimed what had once been farmland, a haunting mirror of the emptiness that had filled the cities months earlier. Travelers wrote of ruined churches with their doors hanging open, of empty cottages filled only with dust and silence. A monk from Cremona described it simply: "Where there were once voices, there is wind." But even in this desolation, small acts of persistence continued. A widow in Brescia reopened her late husband's bakery and fed her neighbors. A group of young apprentices in Verona restarted the Weavers' Guild, naming themselves I Rinati, the Reborn. In Bergamo, the city council commissioned musicians to play at evening vespers, even if only a handful could gather to listen. There was grief, but there was also motion, and motion, however slow, meant hope. By 1632, the worst was over. The graves were covered, the quarantine posts dismantled, and trade began to flow again between the great cities of the north. But the memory of the plague remained etched into the laws, the art, the language, and the conscience of Italy. When later generations looked back upon this time, they did not speak only of suffering, they spoke of endurance. The plague had tested not only bodies, but systems of belief, of government, of reason, and from that test, a new kind of Italy had begun to emerge. The northern states, once divided by rivalry, began to cooperate more often in matters of health and defense. Milan shared reports of suspected infections with Venice. Padua sent doctors to Parma. Florence opened its libraries to scholars studying disease. For the first time, there was a sense that the cities of Italy were bound by more than commerce or politics. They were bound by a shared vulnerability, and therefore a shared humanity. It was, in its quiet way, the beginning of a new kind of unity. And yet, one question remained unspoken, lingering like a shadow in the collective memory. If another plague should come, as surely it would they be ready? That question, though centuries old, echoes even now.
When you walk through the cities of northern Italy today, Venice, Milan, Verona, Bologna, you may pass by marble fountains, small chapels tucked into corners, or worn stone plaques carved with names few remember. Yet beneath those stones lies a story of survival and quiet transformation. The years after the plague were not simply years of mourning, they were years of rebuilding, of redefining what it meant to live, to govern, and to believe. The plague had stripped life to its bare essentials. After so much loss, people began to look differently at the world around them. Even the simplest things, bread, clean water, the morning bell, became small proofs that life still held meaning. This was the atmosphere in which northern Italy, trembling but alive, began to rebuild itself. The silence that followed the plague was not the silence of emptiness, but of reflection. Across northern Italy, as bells tolled for the last of the dead and commerce returned hesitantly to the canals and marketplaces, something profound was changing in the way people thought about life, health, and the world around them. The catastrophe of the 1629 to 1631 plague had shaken not only the foundations of faith, but also the confidence of science and governance. Out of that uncertainty, a new kind of curiosity was born, one that would quietly guide Europe toward modernity. You could say that the plague made Italy think differently about the invisible. Before the epidemic, most explanations of disease had relied on divine will or the ancient miasma theory, the belief that sickness spread through bad air, foul odors, and sin. Physicians of the Renaissance still quoted Galen, the Greek doctor who had lived more than a millennium before them, and prescribed treatments based on balancing the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Bleeding, purging, and fumigation were as much ritual as medicine. But the plague's devastation made such explanations feel hollow. It was impossible to ignore the evidence of one's eyes. Infection spread not merely through air, but through contact, through proximity, through the very act of human connection. People began to suspect that there were forces too small to see, too subtle to sense, that moved silently from person to person. In the city of Padua, which had long been one of Europe's centers of medicine, the professors of anatomy began to dissect not only bodies, but the ideas that surrounded them. Men like Giovanni Battista Morgani, born in the later part of the century, would later found the field of pathological anatomy, the study of how disease altered the organs. His intellectual lineage traced directly back to the plague physicians who had recorded what they saw in 1630: swollen glands, blackened skin, lungs filled with fluid, hearts weakened beyond repair. They were not yet scientists in the modern sense, but their work marked the first shift from superstition toward observation. The idea that knowledge might be found in the material world rather than divine mystery began to take hold. Meanwhile, in the archives of Venice, Milan, and Florence, officials kept meticulous records of every death. They counted the sick, the dying, the quarantined. They mapped which streets had been sealed off, which neighborhoods suffered most, and how long infection lingered. These numbers, gathered originally as instruments of control, would later become the foundation of epidemiology, the statistical study of disease. The plague, in other words, forced Italy to measure itself. And in doing so, it changed the way the state understood its people. The idea that government might have a duty to protect public health through quarantine, sanitation, and communication grew out of these same Venetian and Milanese practices. When later epidemics came to Europe, from cholera in the 19th century to influenza in the 20th, the administrative structures built during the Italian plague provided a model: the Board of Health, the quarantine port, the medical bulletin, the census of mortality. But these innovations did not appear in grand declarations. They emerged slowly, almost shyly, from the quiet rooms of clerks and scholars, as if whispered by memory. While the physicians and officials turned their attention to the body, the artists turned theirs to the soul. The Italian Baroque, which flourished in the wake of the plague, is often remembered for its drama: the swirling clouds, the glowing saints, the ecstatic visions of painters like Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi, and Bernini. But beneath that splendor lay a deep undercurrent of mourning. The brilliance of Baroque light was not only aesthetic, it was spiritual defiance against the shadow of death. In churches rebuilt after the plague, light became a theology of its own.
Architects designed spaces where sunlight pierced the darkness through small, high windows, illuminating statues and altars as if divine grace itself were descending into human sorrow. You can see this in Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, where golden rays fall upon the saint's upturned face, or in the soft glow of candlelit chapels, where painters like Guido Reni and Carlo Dolci depicted martyrs not as distant heroes, but as fragile human sufferers. This shift from triumph to tenderness, from divine wrath to human endurance, was one of the plague's most lasting legacies. It changed how people saw holiness, not as perfection, but as compassion. The saints of the 17th century were not remote figures of glory, but people who shared in pain and yet persisted. Even the simplest village altars reflected this new sensibility. Where once the Virgin Mary had been painted as a queen of heaven, crowned and radiant, she now appeared as a mother weeping over her child or a figure standing at the bedside of the sick. Faith had become intimate. And it was not only art that carried this transformation. Literature, too, bore its marks. In the years following the plague, Italy saw the rise of new forms of writing, private journals, personal letters, and moral essays, where individuals reflected on their experiences and the meaning of survival. The plague of 1630 in particular left a deep imprint on Alessandro Manzoni, the 19th century.
The silence that followed the plague was not the silence of emptiness, but of reflection. Across northern Italy, as bells tolled for the last of the dead and commerce returned hesitantly to the canals and marketplaces, something profound was changing in the way people thought about life, health, and the world around them. The catastrophe of the 1629 to 1631 plague had shaken not only the foundations of faith, but also the confidence of science and governance. Out of that uncertainty, a new kind of curiosity was born, one that would quietly guide Europe toward modernity. You could say that the plague made Italy think differently about the invisible. Before the epidemic, most explanations of disease had relied on divine will, or the ancient miasma theory, the belief that sickness spread through bad air, foul odors, and sin. Physicians of the Renaissance still quoted Galen, the Greek doctor who had lived more than a millennium before them, and prescribed treatments based on balancing the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Bleeding, purging, and fumigation were as much ritual as medicine. But the plague's devastation made such explanations feel hollow. It was impossible to ignore the evidence of one's eyes. Infection spread not merely through air, but through contact, through proximity, through the very act of human connection. People began to suspect that there were forces too small to see, too subtle to sense, that moved silently from person to person. In the city of Padua, which had long been one of Europe's centers of medicine, the professors of anatomy began to dissect not only bodies, but the ideas that surrounded them. Men like Giovanni Battista Morgagni, born in the later part of the century, would later found the field of pathological anatomy, the study of how disease altered the organs. His intellectual lineage traced directly back to the plague physicians who had recorded what they saw in 1630: swollen glands, blackened skin, lungs filled with fluid, hearts weakened beyond repair. They were not yet scientists in the modern sense, but their work marked the first shift from superstition toward observation. The idea that knowledge might be found in the material world rather than divine mystery began to take hold. Meanwhile, in the archives of Venice, Milan, and Florence, officials kept meticulous records of every death. They counted the sick, the dying, the quarantined. They mapped which streets had been sealed off, which neighborhoods suffered most, and how long infection lingered.
These numbers, gathered originally as instruments of control, would later become the foundation of epidemiology, the statistical study of disease. The plague, in other words, forced Italy to measure itself. And in doing so, it changed the way the state understood its people. The idea that government might have a duty to protect public health through quarantine, sanitation, and communication grew out of these same Venetian and Milanese practices. When later epidemics came to Europe, from cholera in the 19th century to influenza in the 20th, the administrative structures built during the Italian plague provided a model: the Board of Health, the quarantine port, the medical bulletin, the census of mortality. But these innovations did not appear in grand declarations. They emerged slowly, almost shyly, from the quiet rooms of clerks and scholars, as if whispered by memory.
When the great silence of death finally lifted from northern Italy, what replaced it was not noise, but hesitation. People spoke softly again, but there was a tremor in their words, a quiet uncertainty in their laughter. The plague had taught them how fragile life could be, and that lesson lingered in everything, in trade, in faith, even in the way people walked through the streets. The plague had not only killed people, it had killed trust. Merchants, once the lifeblood of Italian cities, found that commerce was no longer simply a matter of goods and gold. It was a matter of fear. Ships arriving in Venice, Genoa, or Livorno were treated not with the old enthusiasm of trade, but with suspicion. Every sail on the horizon could mean infection. Every sailor could carry death. The ports of the Adriatic became not gates of prosperity, but walls of caution. It was from this fear that one of Europe's most remarkable institutions was born, the maritime quarantine. Venetian health officials, the provveditori alla sanità, developed a detailed system that would influence every European port for centuries. When a ship approached, it was required to fly a flag declaring its status. Yellow meant suspicion. Black meant death aboard. Crews were confined to their ships, cargoes fumigated with smoke and vinegar, letters dipped in vinegar or scorched to purify them. Entire islands, like the Lazzaretto Vecchio and Lazzaretto Nuovo, were devoted to isolation, their stone walls echoing with the prayers and coughing of the detained. It was from the Italian word 40 giorni, 40 days, that we get the word quarantine. That number, 40, was not arbitrary. It came from the Bible, the 40 days of the flood, the 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. To the Venetian mind, this was not only a medical precaution, but a spiritual one. Purification took time. The soul and the city alike needed 40 days to cleanse themselves. Through this mixture of scripture and science, Italy began, unknowingly, to bridge the old and the new worlds of thought. But even with such measures, trade suffered. The great mercantile families of Genoa and Venice saw their profits dwindle. The once bustling marketplaces were quieter, and the air of abundance that had defined the Renaissance gave way to one of prudence. Wealth became discreet. The ornate silks and jewels that had once adorned the nobility were replaced by dark fabrics, modest embroidery, and subdued tones. Mourning became fashion. And yet, paradoxically, out of this austerity came a new form of beauty, Baroque restraint.
Painters like Salvatore Rosa and Luca Giordano painted landscapes not of paradise, but of ruin. Their skies were heavy with storm clouds, their trees twisted in the wind, their shepherds huddled beneath rocky shelters. Nature was no longer an ideal to be admired, but a force to be feared, vast, indifferent, and divine. It was in these years that philosophy too began to shift. The plague had not only destroyed lives, it had destroyed certainties. Where men had once spoken confidently of divine order, they now spoke of chaos. Where they had once believed that prayer alone could shield a city, they now saw that prayer had failed. And from this failure emerged a new hunger for reason. In Padua, where the university had weathered the storm, a quiet revolution began. Scholars turned away from metaphysical speculation and toward the observation of the natural world. The plague had made them wary of unseen causes that could not be proven. They began to ask, what can we measure? What can we see? What can we test? This spirit of inquiry was not loud or rebellious. It was patient, almost reverent. In the dimly lit laboratories of northern Italy, candlelight glowed over glass instruments, early thermometers, barometers, anatomical sketches. Men like Santorio, a Venetian physician, weighed his food, his sweat, and his breath daily, calculating the invisible processes of the human body. He called it insensible perspiration, the idea that life itself was a balance of hidden exchanges. This experiment, modest as it was, marked the birth of the quantitative mind, the idea that truth could be found not in faith or tradition, but in measurement. And all of it, in some way, was the legacy of the plague. For what is a quarantine, if not a form of measurement, the attempt to draw a line between the safe and the unsafe, the living and the dead? The plague had trained Italians to think in terms of boundaries, thresholds, ratios. It had made them meticulous observers of the invisible, an essential skill for the coming scientific age. Even religion adapted to this new mindset. The Church, though shaken by the failure of its rituals to halt the disease, did not retreat entirely into dogma. Instead, it shifted focus. Priests began to emphasize charity, care for the poor, and moral renewal. The cult of the saints grew, but now with human tenderness. Figures like Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, who had once been intercessors against plague, became symbols of compassion and endurance. Their images appeared everywhere, in frescoes, on prayer cards, and in wayside shrines. In the countryside, peasants built small chapels in their honor, often on the sites where plague pits had been dug. These places of sorrow became places of solace, where villagers gathered not to beg for miracles, but to remember. The faith that survived the plague was quieter, humbler, and closer to the earth. In these little chapels that the first communal prayers for the dead began to take form, the early origins of what we might now call All Souls' Day vigils. Candles flickered through the night, names were whispered, and bells tolled softly for those who had been lost without burial. Death, once feared, was now woven into daily life as something both sorrowful and sacred. But there were darker transformations as well. The economic ruin left by the plague had widened the gap between rich and poor. Many noble families, desperate to rebuild their fortunes, bought up lands abandoned by plague victims, consolidating wealth into fewer hands. Peasants, displaced from their homes, became tenant farmers or laborers. The old communal bonds of medieval Italy, the guilds, the parish brotherhoods, the small urban networks of mutual aid, began to weaken. This growing inequality gave rise to a deep melancholy in Italian culture. You can hear it in the slow, minor tones of early Baroque music, in the lamentations sung in cathedrals, in the tender melancholy of the Lira d'Abraccio, and in the haunting echoes of Monteverdi's Madrigali. The songs of the 1630s and 1640s are full of longing for stability, for meaning, for a world that feels whole again. And yet, beneath that sorrow, there was a new clarity. Italy began to understand that beauty and suffering were not opposites, but reflections of one another. The cracked frescoes, the faded manuscripts, the worn faces in portraiture, all carried the truth that perfection is not the absence of decay, but its acceptance. This acceptance would become one of the defining features of Italian art and philosophy for centuries to come. You can still feel it today in the crumbling grandeur of Venetian palaces, in the serene sadness of Tuscan churches, in the poetry of Leopardi, in the films of...
When the last chill of winter had passed, and the smoke of the plague pyres began to fade from the horizon, Italy found itself standing at a strange threshold, between the memory of death and the tentative murmur of life. Northern Italy, once loud with commerce, faith, and ambition, now seemed half asleep. The bells of Milan rang not for festivity, but to remind the living that they were still here, fragile, altered, uncertain of what came next. The roads that once pulsed with travelers, merchants, and priests were now ghostly quiet. The carters who once hauled barrels of Lombard wine to the ports of Genoa stood idle beside their oxen. The toll houses had collapsed from neglect, ivy curling around their wooden beams. Every bridge seemed to hold its breath. You could walk for hours between towns and hear only the soft rustle of wind over the ruined fields, or the distant call of a solitary bell marking the Angelus. In many villages, there were no priests left to ring it. Some had died in the plague years, others had fled, never to return. The survivors buried their dead without sacrament, using salt and lime instead of holy water. Faith itself seemed to have retreated, replaced by quiet endurance. In the markets of Parma and Mantua, people spoke not of salvation, but of survival. A loaf of bread, a bucket of clean water, these were miracles enough. Yet slowly life began to take shape again. The survivors, though few, were bound by a strange new unity. They shared not just grief, but understanding, an awareness of the fragility of existence, and a gratitude for the simple fact of breath. In the countryside, peasants began to till abandoned lands. Many of them had never owned property before. Now entire estates lay empty, and the few who remained were granted leases they could never have dreamed of. The fields of Lombardy, rich and dark, came alive again beneath their hands. Wheat sprouted where bones had lain. The plow replaced the bier. In Milan, the ruling class, diminished though it was, returned to its administrative routines. Taxes were reinstated, trade reopened, and guilds reformed. Yet everything was quieter. Where once the guild halls echoed with argument and laughter,
Now voices were measured, restrained. The scribes who copied the ledgers did so with a reverence usually reserved for Scripture, as though one careless blot of ink might summon misfortune again. Even art had changed. The great fresco painters who had once filled church walls with brilliant color now worked in muted tones, soft browns, grays, and golds. They painted not triumph, but endurance, the Virgin holding her child not in majesty, but in exhaustion. Saint Sebastian not pierced in defiance, but kneeling in surrender. The art of Lombardy after the plague seemed to whisper rather than sing. And then there were the children, few in number, but precious. Entire villages would gather when a baby was born, as if to witness a miracle. Women who had lost their own would offer milk to another's child. It was not uncommon to find infants given names like Speranza, hope, or Rinato, meaning reborn. These names became talismans against the memory of silence. But even in this quiet renewal, shadows remained. The old plague houses still stood, their windows boarded, their doors marked with faded crosses. No one would live in them again. The very air seemed poisoned by memory. Travelers gave them wide berth, and mothers warned their children not to play nearby, lest the sickness rise again from the dust. On the outskirts of Cremona, one of these houses stood alone beside a half-collapsed well. The villagers swore that on cold nights they could see light flickering through its cracks. The ghost of a plague doctor, perhaps, or a soul who had never been given proper burial. Whether true or not, it reminded them that the past was never far away. Further north, in the mountain valleys of Bergamo, monks began to compile records of the dead. Their ledgers filled with careful Latin inscriptions, nomen ignotum, causa pestis, unknown name, cause plague. They wrote by candlelight, their quills scratching softly against the parchment, the wax dripping like tears. These records would survive for centuries, the only testimony to countless lives erased. Meanwhile, Venice, ever the watcher of trade and tides, turned its gaze to the sea once more. Its lazzaretti, those grim quarantine islands that had once housed the dying, were slowly cleaned and reopened, not as prisons now, but as hospitals of learning. Physicians studied the anatomy of the dead to better protect the living. Apothecaries distilled vinegar and herbs, testing which might purify the air. The Republic Senate funded the first systematic health boards in Europe. From the horror of contagion, an early form of science began to rise. In this strange rebirth, Italy rediscovered something subtle, the value of observation, of knowledge gathered patiently and without pride. The plague had humbled faith and power alike, but it had also cleared a space for reason. The physicians of Padua and Bologna began to speak of natural causes, not divine wrath. They argued that understanding the body might one day free mankind from ignorance. Their words were still cautious, often cloaked in theological language, but beneath them glowed the first embers of enlightenment. And yet, even as minds awakened, hearts remained cautious. People had learned not to trust too much in human control. The world, they believed, was fragile, like a thread stretched between two winds. One breath of pestilence could snap it again. So they lived slowly. The great fairs that once drew thousands now drew hundreds. The nights were shorter, the feasts quieter. Even music softened. Lutes replaced trumpets, choirs sang in lower tones. Everything was made to soothe, not to excite. In the quiet of their evenings, people began to remember the ones who had gone, not in fear, but in reverence. Many towns built small chapels in their memory, not grand cathedrals, but humble stone shrines, where names were whispered into the air like prayers. These became places of comfort for the living, sanctuaries of remembrance. In Bergamo, a single bell was hung in the chapel of San Rocco. It was rung each year on the anniversary of the plague's end, not to mourn, but to remind. The sound was soft, low, and human, a single tone carrying across the hills like a sigh. It told all who heard it that they belonged to a line of survivors, and that life, though fragile, endures. And as spring returned to the northern plains, the fields filled once again with the color of wildflowers, red poppies, yellow primroses, pale blue chicory. They grew in the same soil that had once been filled with death. The farmers did not cut them down. They let them grow freely, saying that they were the souls of the departed, a silent garden for those who had fallen asleep in the earth. It was a tender superstition, born from pain and carried by love. In those moments when the wind passed softly through the tall grass, you could almost believe that the plague had not taken everything, that something, somehow, had been given back in return. Yet beneath that peace, one question lingered in every heart. Will it come again?
The years passed quietly after the plague. By the middle of the 17th century, northern Italy had become a place of recovery, not triumphant, but enduring. Cities like Milan, Venice, and Bergamo rebuilt themselves not from ambition, but from necessity. The wounds of the Great Plague of 1629 to 1631, though faded from the flesh, remained carved deep into the soul of the land. Every generation that followed carried some trace of it, in the way they spoke, in how they built their homes, even in the rhythm of their prayers. No one spoke of before and after. There was only now, a fragile state between remembrance and survival. When you walk through the Lombard countryside, even today, the layout of many villages still bears the mark of that time. Houses were spaced further apart than before, a lingering echo of fear, a memory of contagion. Wells were dug deeper and placed at the edge of town. Doors opened outward instead of inward, so that visitors would not need to touch them to enter. Even architecture had absorbed the memory of disease. Inside the homes, you would find herbs hanging from rafters, lavender, sage, and rosemary, not merely for scent, but for safety. People believed their aroma could purify the air, chasing away unseen corruption. Windows were small and covered with cloth soaked in vinegar. And when strangers came, traders, priests, or travelers from distant towns, the people would still ask softly, "Were you in Milan? In Venice? In Cremona?" As though those names were still half-poisoned. In some families, it became a ritual to light a candle at dusk and set it on the windowsill. It was called La luce dei rimasti, the light of the remaining. It burned in memory of all who had not survived, and as a quiet message to travelers, someone lives here still. The flicker of those lights along the dark country roads gave northern Italy its quiet soul after the plague. A landscape marked not by grandeur, but by gentleness. From the ashes of the plague, something extraordinary began to stir, not in the streets, but in the minds of scholars, doctors, and thinkers. The physicians who had watched whole towns die began to question everything they had once believed. They asked, was it truly God's punishment, or could there be a pattern, a natural cause? At the University of Padua, a young physician named Girolamo Fracastoro, who had lived through the aftermath, wrote quietly of contagion as a physical thing, not a curse. He described how invisible seeds of disease might spread from one body to another.
His ideas would later echo through centuries, becoming the foundation of germ theory long before it had a name. In Milan, the remnants of the plague commissions evolved into the first organized public health offices in Europe. The concept of quarantine, once a desperate measure, became a method, refined, recorded, repeated. Bureaucrats drew charts of infection routes. Clerks maintained death rolls. Physicians compared notes across cities. It was from this administrative web that modern epidemiology, the study of how disease moves through populations, would one day be born. Venice, too, never forgot its role as both gatekeeper and sufferer. The Lazaretti Islands, once places of dread, became laboratories of prevention. Physicians in long robes still walked their halls, but now they carried notebooks instead of censors. They cataloged symptoms, tested herbal remedies, and recorded weather patterns, believing the wind and water held answers. From suffering, order had emerged, and from order, knowledge. The church, too, was changed by the silence of the plague years. In the 1620s, priests had preached repentance, urging the faithful to scourge themselves, to beg for mercy. But after the plague, the tone softened. The survivors no longer feared divine punishment in the same way. They had seen too much, prayed too long, buried too many innocents. Faith became humbler, more inward. The grand cathedrals that rose in the late 17th century, like the rebuilt sections of Milan's Duomo, were still magnificent, but they were no longer monuments of power. They were memorials. Their carvings of angels and saints often showed sorrow, not triumph. Even the marble seemed quieter. In small chapels across Lombardy, new frescoes appeared. Scenes of Saint Rocco, Saint Sebastian, and the Virgin Mary caring for the sick. These were not idealized images. They were tender, weary, profoundly human. The painters, many of whom had lost their families, captured grief with a gentleness that spoke to every soul who entered. It was art not of glory, but of remembrance, a kind of prayer painted in color. In the narrow alleys of Bergamo, old women could still recall the days of the plague for decades after it had ended. They told their grandchildren stories of the wagons that rolled through the streets at dusk, carrying the bodies away, of the men who marked doors with red crosses, and of the silence that followed the ringing of the bells. But they also spoke of kindness, of neighbors who shared bread, of priests who stayed when others fled, of a mother who took in an orphan though she had lost her own. These stories became oral relics, whispered in the long winters when snow covered the fields. Children grew up not just with fear, but with reverence for those who endured. To them, survival was not luck, it was an inheritance. It is said that for a century after the plague, whenever thunder rolled across the Lombard plain, people would fall silent and listen. They called it la voce dei morti, the voice of the dead. It reminded them that the world was fragile and that peace could vanish with a single breath. By the early 1700s, northern Italy had begun to flourish again, quietly, cautiously. The fields produced grain once more, trade routes reopened, and Venice's ships once again carried silk and glass across the Mediterranean. But the people were changed. They no longer chased wealth with the same fever as before. Life was approached like a fragile glass, something to be handled carefully, never taken for granted. Guilds began to include clauses of compassion in their charters,
funds for widows, for the poor, for orphans of disease. Cities introduced systems of charity that resembled early social care. Milan's Ospedale Maggiore, the great hospital, became a symbol not only of healing, but of community duty. Out of the worst suffering, northern Italy had learned the quiet discipline of mercy. In the centuries that followed, Italian thinkers would return again and again to that silent period, trying to make sense of what it meant. Some saw the plague as divine retribution, others as a mirror of human frailty. But a few, the early philosophers of the Enlightenment, began to see it as something more. A moment when humanity was forced to confront its own smallness, and from that humility, to grow wiser. One Venetian scholar, writing in the early 1700s, described it this way: "The plague was the teacher of reason. In our fear, we learn to observe. In our grief, we learn to value. In our silence, we learn to think." Those words, though simple, captured the transformation that had unfolded across northern Italy. From despair had risen curiosity. From ruin, resilience. From death, a deeper reverence for life. Even now, centuries later, if you walk through the streets of Venice or Milan, you can still find traces of that era, not in museums, but in the living architecture. The old quarantine gates still stand along the lagoon. The faded plague crosses are carved into walls. In Bergamo's upper city, a narrow lane called Via della Morte Bianca, the Street of the White Death, leads to a small chapel built by survivors in 1335. Its frescoes are cracked, its colors faded, but when sunlight falls through the narrow window,